Today's webinar will present results from a collaboration between NIDIS and the Masters of the Environment graduate program at the University of Colorado Boulder. Emily Bamford and Marianne Schipple will share with us today their year-long work on this project focused on establishing meaningful drought partnerships with tribal nations. Emily Bamford completed her master's degree at the Masters of the Environment program at CU Boulder, where she specialized in hydrogeology and indigenous studies. Prior to that, she worked for UNICEF on water and climate resilience projects for 10 years across Africa and Asia. She has also worked for Greenpeace, and she runs an education nonprofit for children in Tanzania. Marianne Schipple is a current graduate student at CU Boulder, where she is specializing in environmental policy. She's from Miami, Florida, and prior to moving to Colorado, she was a grassroots environmental advocate for Hispanic communities with Oceana and Citizens for a Better South Florida. We're also very pleased to have with us today Mark Junker. Since 2014, Mark has been the Tribal Response Coordinator for the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. Starting in 2015, Mark, along with the rest of the Sac and Fox Environmental Department, began actively seeking a better understanding of climate change and how the tribe can be more resilient. Since then, they've worked to provide information, training opportunities, and workshops for all the tribes in Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. And I also welcome my colleague, Britt Parker. Britt is the Regional Drought Information Coordinator for the Pacific Northwest and Missouri River Basin Drought Early Warning Systems with NIDIS in Boulder, Colorado. She's worked for NOAA for the last 12 years. Her responsibilities as a Regional Drought Information Coordinator focus on strengthening integrated systems for drought monitoring, forecasting, planning, and preparedness, jointly with federal agency partners, tribes, states, municipalities, partner academic institutions, and other organizations in the regions. Britt was one of the project leads at NIDIS for this tribal engagement work, and she can also speak to any questions you may have regarding the NIDIS Drought Early Warning Systems. With that introduction, I would like to turn the presentation over with thanks to Marianne, Emily, and Mark.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Oh, 1 second. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Not yet.
How about now? You can see it?
Yes.
Okay. So hi everyone, my name's Emily, and as Elizabeth mentioned, over the past year, myself and Marianne, we've been working together with NIDIS to strengthen tribal drought engagement activities in both the Missouri River Basin and Midwest regions. And I just want to start out by saying we've both had a fantastic time doing the project, so a big thank you to everyone that we've worked with over the past year, including first and foremost the tribal partners that we've engaged with, other government agencies, the CASC and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in particular have also been super supportive and helpful. And within NIDIS itself, we haven't been working on the project alone. We've been working with Britt and Molly, and we've also had some fantastic support from both Mark Junker, who you'll hear from later, and James Rathlinleaf as well, who've both provided great mentorship to both of us. So we're very appreciative for that. So engaging with tribal nations is of course so important for all federal agencies. However, in terms of drought, we feel it's especially critical, and there's many reasons for this. Firstly, around 85% of the Western US continues to experience drought on a regular basis, and we know that the situation is only going to get worse. In fact, according to the most recent Climate Science Special Report for the US, temperatures are actually set to increase by the end of the century by 5 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, this is going to cause a lot of issues. And here's the map, which shows the latest projections. And of course, the whole country is set to be affected, but particularly the northeast and the central portion of the United States. And it's this central portion of the US where much of our project has focused over the past year. Related to this also, we're also expecting to see an increased number of consecutive dry days by the end of the century. These dry days are expected to increase between 5 to 20% in most parts of the country, especially the south and northwest, which are going to be hit the hardest. So as you can see, drought, it's a growing problem, and it's really affecting Native American communities in particular. Many reasons for this, including challenges around poverty, water access, and also the fact that water and land play such a central role to Native wellbeing and culture. Many of the reservations also lack weather stations at the moment, and also have limited staff available to work on drought in some cases. And often staff are so busy dealing with all the other issues that they just don't have time to monitor and predict the onset of drought on the reservation. At the same time, we also know that tribal communities possess so much knowledge and experience in terms of dealing with drought, and there's so much that federal agencies can learn from them, particularly in terms of climate resilience and sustainability. Therefore, improving the way in which NIDIS shares their drought information can really help ensure that tribal nations receive timely and relevant drought information, and this ultimately will allow them to mitigate the impacts of drought on the reservations and also put into action their traditional knowledge. Also, in terms of regional and national impacts, improving tribal engagement around drought-related issues can also really help strengthen the drought early warning systems that Elizabeth was talking about previously. And this ultimately will benefit everybody. So, as I'm sure you can appreciate, tribal nations are some of NIDIS's most important partners, and that's why NIDIS ultimately chose to invest in this project.
Hi everyone, it's Marianne. So in order to improve engagement of tribal nations moving forward, we felt it was very important to acknowledge reasons why engagement has been so challenging in the past. First and foremost, there's a long and challenging history of the relationship between Native American communities and the government, such as relocation that's altered the connectedness of the communities with their land, water, and culture. Not only has this undermined trust, it has also increased the risk when facing drought. In addition, tribal resource managers have limited time and patience for engagement that are non-productive, since there's often limited staff and funds. There are other competing priorities, such as flooding and the impacts of pipeline infrastructure in the Midwest and Missouri River Basin, which makes it hard for folks to think about drought, even though we now know that the impacts of drought and flooding tend to alternate. Finally, another reason why tribal resource managers are often reluctant to collaborate with federal and non-federal partners is that the benefits of these projects have tended to be one-sided in the past, particularly in the terms of research and documentation. In fact, a study in 2019 by David Chavez from the Native Nations Institute have found that 87% of climate studies from indigenous communities were extractive, with minimal benefit and return of information and resources to Native communities. These are all key reasons why tribal resource managers are usually reluctant to engage. We also spent a bit of time researching existing engagement strategies, a few of which are listed here, and also talking to key partners such as NOAA's Regional Climate Services, the CASCs, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and the University of Oregon, all of which have been doing great work on tribal drought engagement. So the goals and aim of the NIDIS Tribal Engagement Project with CU Boulder have been to establish and strengthen relationships with tribal resource managers and tribal communities in both the Missouri River Basin and Midwest Dews regions. We really wanted to develop a real and lasting partnership, ones which were truly beneficial to tribal nations and partners that could help strengthen drought resiliency in the long run. A key part of the project was to first speak with Native American resource managers to try and identify areas in which NIDIS can support tribal nations in preparing for and responding to drought. Also, because NIDIS is relatively small, we decided that we needed to figure out where NIDIS could have the most support and the most impact. So to do this, we carried out a tribal drought risk analysis and also developed a series of tribal drought snapshots. In collaboration with tribal resource managers we were able to meet with. And finally, we wanted to put everything we've learned from tribal nations over the past year into writing and developed a tribal drought engagement strategy for NOAA and NIDIS, which could guide their program moving forward.
So as Marianne mentioned, the very first step of the project was to get out there and meet with folks for the first time. And we started out by attending lots of conferences and workshops and other gatherings. And we really took this opportunity to kind of listen and learn from folks and introduce ourselves and the project that we were doing. Doing this really allowed us to make those initial connections. And we established, our first real kind of friendships with folks. And through that, we were then invited to the reservations for follow-up meetings, which include like other tribal staff. During these meetings, we were able to kind of discuss some of the key drought engagement gaps, the ones that were most important to folks. And we then figured out some of the best ways to change this and improve these gaps. So as you can see from the map, we covered a lot of miles in the past year. We visited around 15 reservations in 7 different states. We covered a lot of ground and spoke to hundreds of people over the course of the year. And then, as Marianne mentioned, the next stage was to develop a drought exposure index for all the reservations in the Missouri River Basin and Midwest regions. And this index was basically a compilation of historical drought exposure data from the US Drought Monitor. We went back and we looked at the drought severity and also the duration of drought on each of the reservations for the past 10 years. We looked at all 63 federally recognized reservations in the 2 regions. And these are the top 10 reservations that historically have been at most risk of drought over the past 10 years. So firstly, we have Red Lake Reservation in Minnesota. We have Cheyenne River in South Dakota. And finally, the third most at risk is Blackfeet Nation in Montana. And all these on the list have obviously experienced the worst drought over the past 10 years. We then put this information into a GIS map, and this is the map for the Missouri River Basin. The outline of the MRB Jews region is in blue, and as you can see, the majority of the reservations are greatly impacted by drought. And of course, based on the maps that you saw previously as well, the impact of drought is set to only get worse. Sorry guys, there's somebody cutting grass outside. Apologies for that. And the impact of drought is expected to get worse in the region in the future. So at the same time, the Missouri River Basin tribes were also found to possess less federal funding compared to some of the other tribal nations in the region. They often had fewer staff, particularly when you factor in the reservation size. Many of the reservations in North and South Dakota especially had large populations. In comparison, as you can see from the map, the Midwest has experienced a little less drought over the past 10 years. I think it's important to note that a lot of the reservations in the Midwest are much, much smaller, so you really kind of have to zoom into the map sometimes to see them. But the majority are kind of at moderate or lower risk of drought. Instead, flooding often remains a bigger problem, and you can also see as well the reservations which are located closer to the Great Lakes are least impact of least risk, of being impacted by drought. And in fact, flooding is a more pertinent issue for them throughout the year. So now we're going to hand over to our good friend and colleague, Mark Junker, who's going to speak about his experiences of drought on the Sac and Fox Reservation in Kansas and Nebraska. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Go ahead to the next slide. And I think you brought up a great point where you mentioned that kind of flooding's the big issue with us right now, but it's also a great opportunity to think of drought and realizing that some of the solutions that you would come up with for drought are going to be some of the same things that could assist you with flood, and specifically that would be something like water storage. But we have looked at the drought potential and some of those impacts that would occur, and some of those we already see. One thing I mentioned before, the flooding started last year. In 2018, we came off our regional record for most days without any precipitation. I think we went 62 days without any precipitation at the end of 2018. So the fact is we are going longer and longer between bouts of precipitation. Looking at some of the specific impacts, the water well quality and quantity, we saw those happen last year. There were 4 different wells right on the reservation boundary between the state of Kansas, the Sac and Fox Reservation, and the Iowa tribe that all went dry last year at the beginning of the year. We haven't had a chance to look at the rebound of those wells, but that's something that we're going to try and investigate. And we can also see a lot of competition for water. We already see some farmers during the dry periods dipping their pumps into the Nemaha River, which is the largest river in our region. And we could see more of that, especially as they look to irrigate their crops. And those crops are going to be stressed out. Even this year with the rain, there was enough of a dry spell where the crop roots never really grew past the wet zone. And so when it dried out, they had lacked the ability to grow their root systems deeper and tap into some of that water that's a little bit below the surface than where the root system was currently at. Another thing that's going to impact our community is heat-related and health issues, and combine that with mental health issues as well. Drought stresses the mind as well as the body. We do have a pretty substantial vulnerable population. We look at our elders and also our youth, and asthma is a legitimate health concern, not only on our reservation, but in Indian country as a whole. And so we want to be able to begin to address those. Part of that is making sure that our community building can be set for like a heat relief station for people to come to during the day, or if they need to spend additional time there, we can figure out a way to keep it open for as long as needed during periods of heat and drought. The air quality, again, is directly impacted when we have things drying out and the wind blowing. It's not just dust, but it's all the contaminants that are along the roads. It's just not pure dirt that's blowing in the wind. It could be a lot of different things that get picked up. We recently have a niobium mine that's opened up a few miles from the reservation, and we have no idea what kind of windborne sediments are going to be brought to us from that, and it happens to be located directly upwind. So we hopefully, once that gets going, we'll have some air monitoring and be a little bit more prepared to face what would come from that. And of course, the amount of moisture directly impacts soil health. We recently begun trying to monitor that a little bit better. We do have a couple of soil moisture probes, one really in the backyard of our offices, and the other one a few miles to the east on the Iowa tribe's weather station. And we're just now beginning to collect data on that and hopefully begin to formulate some kind of plan that'll allow us to make sure our soil remains healthy. And again, the first thing I brought up is as you prepare for drought, you're also increasing your resiliency to any potential flooding that may happen. And we saw that in spades this year. Next slide. And then when we look at engaging and collaborating with other groups, we've had tremendous success. Really, the whole idea of coming up with our own plan was a direct result of attending some other tribal presentations that were done where they spent a great deal of money and were basically told that to make your tribe more resilient, you just have to get more wealth. And we really kind of believed that that was not a legitimate answer. There were more science-based. Yeah, creating more wealth would be great, but it's something that's going to take a lot more time than actually coming up with some concrete plans. And so we've engaged with federal agencies like NOAA and FEMA. Those are probably the two biggest ones. And we're all in our environmental department working off EPA grants, so we include them as well. And we've really had some good synergy between our base programs and our federal partners. And we're in a situation where we don't have a person that's committed to drought or climate. We do it because it's important to us. It's something that is necessary, we believe, for the tribe to build its capacity to be more resilient. And so the federal partners have generally been on board with the project we've undertaken, and all our funding comes from the BIA with regard to the different projects that we do relating to the climate resilience. The state partners are kind of new to the party, but we've really begun to improve our contacts at the state level, especially with FEMA and some of the departments of natural resources in both Kansas and Nebraska. And we're really looking forward to seeing, how those can progress. And we're doing, a lot of the work that we're doing can be duplicated for the counties and communities that surround us. So we don't want to exist in that vacuum. We want to be partners. And then on the regional level, we have things like the CASC and the Missouri RAPS and different groups that really have the potential to provide us with data as well as, help with some planning and suggestions to make our work a little bit more relevant within the regional community. And then at the county level, we get some good participation from our county emergency management. We really haven't dealt too much with the extension offices yet, but we see our county officials attending a lot of our outreach materials. And as we start looking at the different opportunities that we have, we really need to improve some of our infrastructure. We have a lot of minimum maintenance roads that are really impacted by the flooding. And depending on what your need is, we had an instance where we couldn't get to our buffalo to provide them food during the floods. And so it really became an exercise in trying to, how do you move a bale with a Polaris? Some really creative thinking that went on to make sure our buffalo herd was able to maintain their health. And of course, we're always looking for technical assistance, especially, like I said, we don't have a person designated as, this is your job to do climate resilience. So we quite often wonder, from everything from, what's this word mean to have you heard how other tribes or other communities have dealt with a particular problem? And that's why we really enjoy looking at case studies, because we can see things that are similar to us. And we're a small tribe, but we take things away from the big tribes as well. And I think one of the things that we're really looking at is, how many tribes with around 400 members are doing this kind of climate work, and what are their success stories. And a lot of the projects that we deal with are going to require cost matches, especially when you're dealing with FEMA and the NRC. So those are things that we're looking at. Where does the government's trust responsibility actually mention that there's a cost match? So there's even some policy things as well that we need to investigate further. Next slide. So again, the challenges are making drought relevant. It's really pretty difficult to talk about drought when we have the entire Missouri River channel overflowing its banks and closing roads and shutting down bridges. And so what we do is kind of look at some of the historical data and show some of the impacts that have happened in the past, going back to the 70s. There was a bit of drought going on back then. And it's one of those instances where we really like to rely on our elders to have them provide stories and anecdotes of how they may have coped with drought in the past. As far as successes go, we put out climate summaries quarterly. In fact, I'm working on one right now. They go out to virtually all the tribal members. We put them in our truck stop and trading posts. We give 125 copies to the other 3 Kansas tribes, which includes the Iowas, the Kickapoo, and the Prairie Band Potawatomi. And they all share somewhat in the creation of the climate summaries. And we're going to do another training in March that is going to show how they're made and how to manipulate the data so that you can put in a form that people understand without having to have a PhD in climatology or something like that. We also recently had a training up at the Santee Sioux, which focused on drought early warning systems. Again, all 9 of the tribes from Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa attended. And really, it was designed to set up a flow chart that would guide people into saying, hey, you're about to enter into a drought. Do you need to make any decisions? You're in the drought. What kind of decisions will you make for that? You're coming out of the drought. Can you relax some of the ordinances that you may have put into place so that people can go back to using their water like they had in the past and their activities? And lastly, we're doing some climate adaptation planning. This is an ongoing BIA grant that we have, and we'll probably complete that in the summer of 2021. And as far as priorities go, the big thing is, we've got these great plans that we've sat down and written down, and we need to put them into action. How do we get the different departments, not just the environmental department, but housing and maintenance and social services and the tribal council, how do we engage them to make that plan a part of their everyday business? And next. This is just a quick picture that I had taken showing one of those minimum maintenance roads after a flash flood event in June. It was just as dry as the picture on the right, about 12 hours before the picture on the left was taken. And then about 24 hours after the one on the left, it's back to being a very passable road. In the meantime, if you look at the tree line in the background, that's beyond that is a creek. And then on the other side of the creek is where our bison herd's located at. And so you can see getting to them was a bit of a challenge. And literally it can be a challenge because of snow and other things as well. But that's the end of my section. I'll turn it back over to Emily.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mark. Okay.
Yeah, Mark, thank you so much for sharing insights of your community. So as we mentioned before, we've developed a series of 20 tribal drought snapshots in both regions. These snapshots provide information on drought trends and impacts, mitigation efforts, future outlooks, engagement opportunities, key resources, and contacts. We hope this will be useful for future drought planning. The snapshots and the strategy will be shared with all of you participating in this webinar when they're available on the US Drought portal. So the next step of our project was the engagement strategy, and this was based on the voices of all the tribal citizens we've spoken to over the past year. We just wanted to take this moment to highlight a great quote from Daniel Wildcat, a member of the Muskogee Nation. This quote helps highlight the trust, kindness, and authenticity which plays such an important role in building relationships with Native American partners. It also extends to how Native Americans view their environment, every aspect of which they consider their relatives. very unlike the Western culture, which tends to see the environment as more of a resource. The final part of the project was to develop a NIDIS tribal drought engagement strategy. This essentially includes a set of key guiding principles for future engagement and key priorities with specific activities around each of the dues areas, which are listed here on the right. All of these have been developed based on the conversations we've had with more than 50 tribal natural resource managers over this past year. NIDIS is incorporating many of these proposed activities in their work in 2020. In addition, reciprocity is such an integral part of Native culture. It's also been a key barrier to engagement in the past. And as we've mentioned before, engagement with tribal nations can often be one-sided in terms of benefits. Therefore, as part of our project, we've made a real effort to make sure that something was given back. This includes supporting trainings and workshops, developing the snapshots, presenting our findings, providing technical guidance and support with grant writing. Another way non-Native folks can give back is to elevate Native voices and ensure real participation in all aspects of their programs and strategies. And of course, there's always small tokens of appreciation for people's times and efforts. We definitely gave out a few huckleberry pies this summer.
So we've both learned a lot over the past 9 months. So it's really hard for us to pick our top lessons, but here are a few of them. Firstly, we learned that tribal engagement can be really tough. There's understandably a deep historical mistrust, and building meaningful engagement really requires face-to-face interaction. And it also really needs consistent, regular meetings with tribal partners in order to build up that trust, which is so important. We also learn as well that being kind, being authentic, and also being humble are so important in building, real and lasting relationships. And honestly, once you do this, everything else is pretty easy from there. However, we've also witnessed a couple of times on the flip side of this, how just a single bad interaction can actually jeopardize future interactions with that organization. And that's why we feel things such as cultural intelligence training and other measures can be really important, particularly for those staff who are wanting to work with tribal partners in the future. Okay, and almost every tribal resource manager we spoke to stated as well that they wanted simpler, more culturally relevant data. The feedback we got was that there's just too much information out there on drought. Not all of it's always reliable, and it's not always useful or relevant to tribal nations. And finally, as you can see from the maps that we showed you and the analysis that we did, there are major variations in drought exposure, and also the capacity to respond to drought amongst tribal nations, particularly in terms of the funding that's being received at the moment. So therefore, we really feel that NIDIS and other agencies should really prioritise their engagement and financial support accordingly to try and help fill some of these gaps. So, as just mentioned, technical and financial support should always be prioritised to where it can have the biggest impact. We also think it's so important to expand the drought risk analyses that we began at both the tribal and also the regional levels, and kind of ensure these are rolled out across the country. This is really important for tribal nations, but also for other partners also. And a major gap that we found is that drought forecasting tools rarely contain reservation-specific information. In fact, many of the reservations aren't even outlined in the prediction tools and maps. They're not even there. And many tribes, therefore have to rely on information which comes from tens of miles away, and it's not always relevant to the current conditions on the reservations. And this is something that NIDIS has been really working on the past few weeks to try and change. They're hopefully launching the drought.gov website in the next couple of months, and it will contain, much simpler reservation-specific drought data, which we hope, based on our discussions with tribal resource managers, will be really useful now for tribal citizens. As I've mentioned as well, there's also major variation in funding allocation for climate resilience between tribal nations, and often those with the worst drought risk are not receiving the financial support they need. And unfortunately, at the same time, even when they do receive funding, it's mostly for planning or training and not really direct mitigation. So as such, we're really hoping that federal partners may be able to come together and really make an effort to make sure that this funding is more accessible and that it can be used to address any inequities that exist. We're still brainstorming exactly on what this might look like. We don't know whether this might be a joint fund or just working with existing mechanisms to make sure that they're more equitable and more accessible. Another recommendation is that government agencies and other organisations should hire or continue to hire dedicated tribal liaison staff. This is so important in terms of maintaining meaningful relationships with tribal nations. One key piece of feedback that we did receive was that high rates of staff turnover are a real reason why tribal staff get so tired of engaging over and over. It's pretty exhausting to have to repeat the same thing to different folks from different agencies and then have staff turn over quite rapidly. And finally, although this might sound pretty obvious, we also think it's so important that tribal perspectives and priorities are streamlined into all drought policies, strategies and outreach. And it can't just be an afterthought, it has to be included from day one. Tribal staff shouldn't be just asked to review a document at the end. They must be completely involved in planning and also developing projects too. So this is something that can be improved moving forward. So in conclusion, we'd really love to see all partners come together and try and find a way to address the gaps that we've discovered over the past year. If you have any ideas on how to do this, we'd love to hear from you. So please, just write any suggestions in the chat box. You're also welcome to reach out to us a bit later via email, and we'll share our contact details with you in a moment. So in conclusion, drought, as you know, is truly a cross-border issue. It's affecting all of us and it's only going to get worse. So it's so important that we all work together in order to try and mitigate these impacts, because at the end of the day, we're so much stronger together. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I'm now going to hand over to Mark, who's going to facilitate the questions. Over to you, Mark.
Alrighty. I don't have any questions here. Am I not looking at the?
Mark, this is Elizabeth. There's a question box in the control panel. You just click on that. I can start. I can start the process.
Okay.
I'll first say thanks so much to Emily and Marianne for your presentation, sharing your work and your recommendations on tribal engagement. And thank you very much, Mark, for sharing the perspectives of the Sac and Fox Nation. We really appreciate it. Again, to all the attendees online, you are muted, so if you do have questions, please type them in the question box on the control panel. And we do have several questions. I will start with one of them. Marianne and Emily, you mentioned inequities in funding allocations. Where do you see the biggest inequities and what do you think this was?
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. For the regions we were looking at, the two states that really kind of stood out to us the most in terms of receiving the least drought funding were actually North Dakota and South Dakota. When we were doing the analysis, we factored in the size of the population living on the reservations, and we found that overall these two states, had received the least funding for climate resilience activities, but also water and drought activities as well. The reasons for this, honestly, I'm not really sure. We do know most of the tribes do apply for funding regularly, but they're just not receiving it. And we're not sure if this is down to just a simple issue of not having adequate time or capacity to write the proposals. And I'm sure this varies very much according to tribal nations. But I do think it's probably something that federal agencies especially should consider, particularly when they're allocating their funding. You know, which reservations could this funding have the biggest, positive impact? Will it allow the reservations, for example, to just move beyond the planning stage? And as we mentioned earlier, a lot of climate resilience funding is, just for planning. So what can we do really in terms of, mitigation and really kind of improving drought resilience on these reservations?
Thank you, Emily. Mark, do you want to read out the questions, or would you like me to continue?
Yeah, if you would. I can only get like one line at a time, and it's really small, so it's almost impossible for me to read the questions.
Okay, I'm happy to continue.
Thank you.
So Mark, a question for you. What are a few simple things that folks from both the government and other organizations can do after leaving this webinar to make a positive change in terms of engagement? What might be easy wins right now that can have the most impact?
That's a great question, and I think if you're motivated to do it, it's going to vary tribe to tribe. One of the things that I looked at right away when I was getting involved with this is how some of the environment has changed just in the past 20 years, like the number of species that are no longer present on the reservation, or at least not in the abundance they once were. Specifically, the ones that I noticed were monarch butterflies and some of the upland birds like quail and pheasant. 20 years ago, I used to have to make sure I didn't travel on the reservation near dusk because I know I'd get a pheasant in my radiator. Just as recently as 15 years ago, we used to have a huge monarch migration that would stop by, and that was usually annually at the end of September, and neither of those things happen anymore. So the way I kind of gathered support was kind of looking at just some things that people had noticed, and that kind of put me in the right community of people that wanted to see some more advancement in this line of work. The other thing that you can do as far as quick wins is go to the High Plains Regional Climate Center. They have some really easy to access data that can kind of show, what are your precipitation trends like? The one thing that really stood out this year was our wettest year in the last 125. And so that's something that's really easy to take to someone and show. But on the other hand, like in the Pacific Northwest, it was their 35th driest year ever. And so some of these are really easy to access data points. And if you ever have any questions about it, feel free to email me. My contacts information is up there. If there's a specific piece of data, I'd be more than happy to show you how to access it, or if I can't show you, I can put you in touch with someone that definitely does know how.
Thank you, Mark. There's another question here. Is there a written methodology on how you computed historical drought risk scores?
Okay, Elizabeth, I can answer that one. We don't have anything right now we can share, but we're happy to compile that and share that with participants if they're interested. We can probably get that to you within the next week or so.
Thank you, Emily. And similarly, someone said, can these recommendations on tribal engagement be sent to us? Is there a fact sheet?
Not right now, but we can definitely make one of those as well.
Okay.
We're developing an engagement strategy as well. So that's kind of a more lengthy version of what we've presented today. So we can actually share that as well, hopefully within the next few weeks, maybe. It's still in draft form at the moment, but it's almost finalized.
Thanks, Emily. We have another question here. Very informative, encouraging to see the work you have done. Do you know of any similar research or collaborative work with tribal groups in Canada?
We didn't actually look directly at what's been done in Canada. We were mostly focused on the US. But if you would like more information on that, we do have some contacts that we can share with you, and also some resources as well, if that's something you're interested in.
Okay, thanks.
And
Emily.
that's also an issue that we tried to bring to light before the last National Climate Assessment was brought up, because even though NOAA and these groups don't deal directly with Canada, a lot of the trends we see, they're going to be impacting us in the lower 48. They're already experiencing them in places like Saskatchewan and Ontario, and it would be neat to see in graphical form some of the same data sets that are being plotted for the lower 48, extend them up into Canada, so we can see that, because otherwise you're kind of just looking at Alaska in a vacuum and not really realizing what's going on around Hudson Bay, what are the river systems like up there. And there are rivers, especially like in the Dakotas and Minnesota that do flow into Hudson Bay. Even in Montana, there's rivers that flow into Hudson Bay. It'd be interesting, and I think almost necessary to see that data, and I think that would make for real easy collaboration too.
Thanks, Mark. Here's a question of whether this program will expand to tribes outside of the Missouri River Basin in the Midwest, and if a tribe is interested in partnership engagement, how should they reach out? Britt, perhaps you could take that one?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. So this initial project was piloted in the Missouri River Basin and the Midwest Drought Early Warning System regions. We would like to continue to expand the work and are looking as a program at ways we may be able to do that moving forward into the future. But the initial focus was on the Missouri River Basin and the Midwest.
Thanks, Britt. Here's an interesting question. On the ranking of tribal communities and their historical drought exposure, why do you think it is that a tribal community could have a high risk score when another tribal community that is relatively close does not have as high of a score? It seems that communities that are close together would have similar scores.
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, I think a part of it may be due to water access within the reservations if they have different systems. For example, different aquifer levels, things like that. And also the resilience may vary between reservations, as we mentioned before, based on funding or population size or other kind of social constraints. So this might be a reason why drought may affect some reservations more than others.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions about whether these efforts are only focused on federally recognized tribes. Perhaps somebody could speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, we can speak to that. Oh, sorry. Do you want to talk, Mark? You can answer it.
I just had a quick comment. Is the reason the focus is on federally recognized tribes is a lot of it's funding based, and the non-federally recognized tribes don't have the same opportunities to receive like the BIA grants that we do. That's not to say that we wouldn't be interested in partnering with someone or a tribe that wasn't federally recognized. It's just the tribes in our region are federally recognized, but the reason that we focus on that is strictly the funding mechanism.
Thank you, Mark. I have another one that perhaps you could answer, Mark. How do you get executive management buy-in to incorporate tribal perspectives every step of the way?
That's a great question. It's something that we're working on, but probably the biggest key was the amount of flooding that we had going on this year, and how it literally was impactful enough that on a couple of occasions we had to shut down our offices up here because the flooding had backed up our septic system, and we had 2 inches of sewer water in the community building. And so it became really pretty obvious that some things need to be done. And, you know, when it impacts social services, it impacts the police, it impacts our department. We spent a lot of time, you know, chasing down different elements to you know, give us some resiliency and literally just kind of staunch the flow of water into some of the buildings. And along with that was the belief that, hey, if we had some more storage capacity for water, these impacts wouldn't have been nearly as harmful. And so we can do some things to create some storage. We've got FEMA involved. We may be doing something with stormwater runoff and a gray water recycling system. And because it was so prominent, we did see the buy-in from not just the council, but the other departments as well.
Thanks, Mark. Another question here: how can states help better and partner with the federal government to address funding gaps?
That's a good question as well, because in some instances, in particular programs, we have a really good working relationship with the state. But for the most part, we kind of rely on our federal partners just because of that whole government to government type issue. We think that we should be on the equal with states, but we also realize that for practical matters, you know, it would be nice to take some of the work that they've done and be able to apply it in situations that we can use. And I think the biggest thing that you need to do is reach out to the states, because in a lot of cases, they don't even realize tribes exist. And so you need to begin the educational process of how you want to take advantage of some of the resources that they have to benefit your tribe and your community.
Great, thank you, Mark. We have a couple questions here about engaging with tribal colleges and universities in this work, with this project and with NIDIS more broadly.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. I can take that one. We did do some engagement with tribal colleges, both the faculty and the students. We spent time at Little Bighorn College, which is on the Crow Reservation, and we also spent time at Kandeska Sikana Community College up in North Dakota on Spirit Lake Reservation. So we made a lot of connections there, and it's actually going to be an integral part of the engagement strategy moving forward that we're hoping to roll out in 2020. Marianne can also add something as well, because she engaged with tribal students.
Yeah, we engaged with Native interns from the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance that were doing similar drought work in the Missouri River Basin. And we,
sorry for interrupting, Marianne. It's very hard to hear you. Could you speak a little more loudly or closer to the microphone?
Yes, of course. I just wanted to add as well that we worked with Native American interns from the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance, who's doing similar drought investigation, whom we partnered with in the Missouri River Basin.
Thank you.
And Elizabeth, this is Britt. I'll just add that NOAA as a whole also has programs engaging with the tribal colleges and universities, and we have also been trying to make those connections within our agency to better partner when there are you know, meetings and opportunities through NOAA as well with the TCUs.
Thanks. We have another question here. What sort of drought monitoring information were the tribal farmers most interested in? Was water irrigation efficiency or soil moisture monitoring an interest?
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. They were. Oh, do you want to take that, Mark, either?
Yeah, the first one you mentioned about irrigation efficiency, that's a huge issue on our res. It seems really kind of crazy. You'll walk out there about noon on a day with about 30-mile-an-hour winds, and these guys are doing a great job of watering our highway. We really have some issues with that. Again, with drought conditions, things like that need to be put an end to, but actually coming up with a number for irrigation efficiency is something that would be great to have. I've not seen any numbers like that, and so it really has me begging the question, where can I get that data? or is it data I need to compile on my own? The soil moisture data, we're just now getting to the point where we're trying to understand what does the number mean. I think we're looking at maybe some State Department of Agriculture guidelines, for what is the optimum soil moisture. And so we want to create an index using that for the soils on our reservation, which are mostly glacial tilled.
I also wanted to add that Native American resource managers were very interested in having drought information that are culturally relevant, such as crops that are at risk and game that are traditional game that are at risk and that could impact their traditional ceremonies.
Great, thank you for answering the questions. We've had several questions about accessing the reports and publications and this webinar recording. We will send you a notification when those materials are available on drought.gov. The address for the web address for drought.gov is on your screen, www.drought.gov. And you're welcome to look there for other NIDIS and other drought materials. And we will definitely be in touch with you. We will also follow up on the many wonderful questions that you asked during and after this webinar by email. I'm sorry we didn't have enough time to handle all these great questions. Thank you again so much, Emily, Marianne, Mark, and Britt, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. It was a great webinar. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.